to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. As folks familiar with this show know, I'm a fan of early 70s Christian rock. And I've been collecting this stuff for a long time. I make collections. I give it out to people. I've written about it in a number of places. And, it's a funny sort of obsession because most of the people that I know who aren't Christian aren't particularly interested in hearing this music, even though they'll happily listen to gospel music and gospel-inflected R&B. There's something about the white hippie Christians of the early 70s that kind of turned folks off. And for the most part, I'm fine, whatever. If you're not into it, you're into it. I have my own reasons for it, my own interests in American Christianity and religious experience and the history of the counterculture and all of its guises. And that's one side of the counterculture that really doesn't get much attention from people who are, still identified with it, partly because it's like people, they're Christians, they don't fit, when actually the story is much more complicated, as we'll hear today. But for the most part, even though I think there's a lot of amazing music, some incredible psychedelic rock records, some incredible mystic hippie records, mostly on their own labels, self-produced, amateurish in some ways, but really profound and earnest in a lot of ways. For the most part, if people aren't into it, I don't push it. I don't think there's something that they should hear. I don't think you should necessarily grok Fraction's Moonblood, even though it's a masterpiece of psychedelic guitar ferocity. But there's one figure associated with the Jesus movement scene in the late 60s and early 70s that I believe is a genuine grade A rock star who has never gotten the attention that he should from other rock fans, for people who are just interested in that music and that genre, and particularly in charismatic, politically engaged, troubling, rock and roll maestros who are amazing performers. And this character is Larry Norman, who's got a different kind of story. He came from a more mainstream background, and with major label supports. His first sort of solo record is on a major label, 1969, Upon This Rock, with some great hits on it. Didn't do so well and went off on his own. We'll hear more about that with our guest today, who's Gregory Alan Thornbury, who wrote this wonderful rock bio, Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music? Larry Norman and the Perils of Christian Rock. But again, Larry Norman transcends even questions of Christianity in terms of his performative power and the way in which he used some influences, Rolling Stones, Dylan certainly on the lyrics, and mixed them into a very powerful and long-running rock career with enough problems, bumps on the road, personal breakdowns, financial confusions to make for a good rock bio, which is why the devil should have all the good music, is a good example of. So with no further ado, the author, Gregory Alan Thornbury, welcome to Expanding Mind.
It's great to be on the program. Thank you so much for having me, Erik.
No problem. And I got to say, like, one of the reasons why when I got the book in the mail, and I was really excited that a notable press would put out a book like this, and I was very happy. It's nice hardcover, got the whole story, and then I went to the back, as I often do, and I saw your author photo, and it's so excellent. I don't know exactly how to describe the hairstyle, the way it falls over the front of your brow, and then you have this kind of this marvelous proud expression, and you have these classic old books behind you, and then the classic conservative bow tie, which just you wear with such finesse. So I was like, this is going to be fun. That was my attitude. And so in a way, I kind of want to start with you because I don't know. I know you talk a little bit in the book about when you first heard Larry Norman and when you were listening to the current Christian rock and Christian popular music of your era when you were in college or in graduate school. And that's when you first kind of discovered Larry Norman. So I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about where you were, what you were studying, what your kind of frame was, and then how music, both Christian music and weird popular music. I know you've written about Daniel Johnston, for example. Something I was completely obsessed with in my own rock and roll history, and so you have good taste. So I'd love to hear how music functioned for you in the situation of your studies, of your theological studies, and it's particularly your discovery of Larry Norman.
Well, I come from a musical family. My father is a multi-instrumentalist. He was pastor, but he was also quite a talented musician. Was in like a gospel quartet back in the 50s and 60s, and plays honky-tonk piano like Mickey Gilley. And so I grew up in a very musical home, and most of my relatives play or sing one thing or another. So I was always surrounded by music. I wasn't allowed to listen to rock and roll growing up, though, with some notable exceptions. Like we had like the Elvis Christmas record, but rock and roll was definitely not a good thing. My parents thought it would lead me down the primrose path to disaster. And so, of course, that's exactly what I was attracted to. I remember getting into, a good bit of trouble the first time I brought home, I think it was a Dire Straits record home, and kind of surreptitiously it was found in my desk drawer. So I lived in that sort of Christian fundamentalist world in which, it's hard for people to remember a time when this was the case, but there really was a time when your youth pastor would invite you to church, and the activity was to bring your Led Zeppelin and Beatles albums and throw them on a bonfire and burn them. There was that time. So, of course, I was attracted to rock and roll, and I wanted to play it. And my dad taught me folk-style guitar, like a la Peter, Paul, and Mary, but I soon learned to play rock and roll. And I started playing bands when I was in college. And I wound up working at this Christian radio station because I was at an FM radio station that was attached to my alma mater, Sci College. And I hated everything I heard on this Christian radio station because the Christian music that I heard sounded like a pale imitation of everything that I actually liked. And I actually noticed in the promotionals for these musicians or for these records, it was like, if you like the sound of James Taylor, you will like the sound of whoever, David Meats, or you like, Billy Joel, you'll like Wayne Watson or whatever. And I just thought it was miserable. But at the radio station, there was one semi-professional DJ who was older who said, I think there is one record that you would like. And he took me out of the control booth. This was all CDs at this point. And he went out into the stack of vinyl, and he pulled off the shelf Only Visiting This Planet by Larry Norman. And I went into the other sound booth and lowered the needle down on the record. And I flipped the record cover over, and I was like, wow, this is produced by a group put together by George Martin, the Beatles producer. And the musicians on this record are people that I can identify as like actual rock and roll people, like John Wetton from King Crimson was playing bass. And I was just blown away by the record. And it was on a secular record label, MGM Verve. And so I was like, wow, there's actually one rock star in Christian rock. Now, I went on to later find out other stuff that I liked. But that was sort of the beginning of it, because I myself was playing in bands, and I was listening to Bob Dylan and The Clash and Elvis Costello and U2. And there just wasn't anything that I heard in the Christian genre that sounded that good. And so I kind of coined a phrase that, I've been associated with over the years, which is Christian is the greatest of all nouns and the lamest of all adjectives. Because when you say Christian rock or Christian art or Christian films, it always means like it's not as good as the actual thing.
That's really great. Just to give people a taste, because I suspect that most people listening to the show have not heard Larry Norman, we're going to play just a brief excerpt of the start of one of the great tunes, many great tunes on Only Visiting This Planet from 1972. This tune is called Why Don't You Look Into Jesus? So we'll play this right now.
Sipping whiskey from a paper cup, you drown your sorrows till you can't stand up. And take a look at what you've done to yourself. Why don't you put the bottle back on the shelf? Yellow-fingered from your cigarettes, your hands are shaking while your body sweats. Why don't you look into Jesus? He got the answer.
Okay, that was Why Don't You Look Into Jesus from Larry Norman, or at least a little brief selection of it. And one of the questions I have for you, I know this is a big theme in the book, and I think one of the most interesting theme, and something that I had, as a fan of this music and also more amateur, self-printed, self-published Jesus music from the early 70s, that I hadn't really thought of as much as you brought forward, which is this kind of, who is he doing this for? Who is he singing for? Like especially when his first records, he's on a major label. So in some sense, he's got an audience of broader rock fans. And yet, as a Christian, a self-identified Christian, he's also has sort of the burden or the pressure to represent Christianity, to be Christian, to give something to other Christians that are going to satisfy them or orient them or something. So in some ways, it's a very complicated place. And of course, this track, he's talking directly to fellow baby boomers who are mired in drugs and sex and confusion and occultism, and he's trying to suggest another way, but at the same time, there's something really complicated and kind of difficult about the position that he's in.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a high wire act. I mean, he's torn between two worlds. He's torn between the world of Christ and the world of the devil, which is, the secular rock and roll music industry that was, and both the church and the secular music industry was completely befuddled by Larry Norman's project. The church didn't want to have anything to do with it because it did think rock and roll was of the devil. And so they wanted to suppress this movement. They thought that Larry Norman was the Pied Piper that was going to lead the kids astray. And, Professor Hill from the Music Man that, is going to destroy them. And on the other side, secular record labels saying, what's the market for this? Who is going to listen to this? Because you have to remember, at the time, there was no billion-dollar Christian music industry. Larry Norman sort of unintentionally started that by recording this movement that then later caught on with a revival that was beginning to happen in Southern California called the Jesus Movement. And then it later became commercial, which was religious-infused rock and roll, because we all know songs that came out after Larry Norman, like Jesus Is Just All Right With Me by the Doobie Brothers, or Presence of the Lord by Blind Faith, Eric Clapton and Steve Winwood. Bridge Over Troubled Water was sung in churches by Simon Garfunkel. My Sweet Lord by George Harrison. All that stuff came out in the early 70s, kind of post-Jesus movement. So there was a commercial market developed for this, but when Larry Norman recorded Upon This Rock in 1969 for Capitol Records, it was a brand new thing. And if you went down to Tower Records, there was no genre called Christian psychedelic music.
Yeah, and I think one thing that would be helpful at this point is to just give a little bit more of a background on the Jesus movement, this unique period in American Christianity and in the counterculture. And again, one of the things that interests me about the Jesus movement, and I've actually done a lot of study, and I'm fascinated by many of the characters, both the sort of older preachers who kind of discover and begin to minister to hippies and young people, and then also the people's stories going through Christian communes. And one of the things that's interesting about that whole movement is that everybody disowns it. As I said, like the story of the counterculture, people are happy to talk about Hinduism and how that, meditation and Buddhism and how that influenced today, but they don't really even acknowledge the fact that many, especially in the late 60s, that there was this really powerful few years where very countercultural young people who were, into drugs, into experimentation, whatever, stepped in towards a kind of Christianity that was still very radical. Again, some of them were living in communes. Some of them were completely rejecting the idea of the church. They were like, I'm not religious. I'm a Jesus person. And it was very radical. And at the same time, within American Christianity, the history, people within, evangelical and fundamentalist movements, they don't really want to talk about that stuff until it becomes integrated enough, incorporated enough, tamed enough that they can say, okay, this is actually just another form of American Christianity that we can recognize and is actually quite influential. But there's this period of time in the late 60s and very early 70s that nobody really wants to deal with. So I'd like to hear you talk about a little bit about that larger context and how Larry Norman related to that and the pivotal role he played in kind of giving those people a focus, at least in terms of musical leadership.
Well, Larry was at the vanguard of all of that. And going back to the song that you played, Why Don't You Look Into Jesus, that song was written for Janis Joplin, because Larry, when he was in his band People in 1967, 1968, they were opening up for Jimi Hendrix and the Doors and Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company and Santana and groups like that. So he was rubbing shoulders with all these people, and he could look on stage, from the artist area, and the opening image of Why Don't You Look Into Jesus is sipping whiskey from a paper cup. You drown your sorrows till you can't stand up. He's talking about Janis Joplin, yellow figure from your cigarette, your hands are shaking while your body sweats. Why don't you look into Jesus? He actually was doing this as an evangelistic outcry to that generation to say, listen, you've tried LSD, you've tried drugs, you've tried free love, and it's sort of run its course. There's this moment in the book where I talk about George Harrison visiting the Haight-Ashbury district with Patty, at the height of that movement. And he said, I thought I was going to find all these beautiful, enlightened people. And what I found was just a complete, sociocultural disaster that was happening out there. So that was the group that Larry was trying to speak to. And he had the mouthpiece of a secular record label, and it was incredibly countercultural. It wasn't until a couple of years later where the one-way sign, which Larry invented in concert, with one finger pointed towards heaven, which got imitated by people, where instead of clapping after his songs, to applaud, they would just point one finger into the sky to say, it's only about Jesus. So you'd have silence instead of applause. All of that stuff became commercialized later on, and that's the moment at which a real radical like Larry wanted to have nothing to do with it anymore, because it had become commercialized.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about his Christianity. I mean, especially if people aren't that familiar with the wide variety of ways that people can consider themselves Christian in the modern West. You think of someone like Larry. Oh, he's judgmental against alcohol or whatever. So what? He's some kind of conservative church believer. But he was an extremely radical person, and his Christianity was very radical. And his attitude towards the church, which was also true of so many of the younger Jesus people, was quite hostile. And so it's a very interesting mix. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about in what ways did he consider himself to be a Christian, and in what ways did he find fault with other people who were calling themselves Christian at that time?
Well, in terms of his core belief system, it was, the term would be orthodox. I mean, it was pretty orthodox in the sense that he would have been able to recite in good conscience the Apostles' Creed. He believed that the Bible was actually God's word. He definitely believed that you needed to come to terms with the person of Jesus of Nazareth and his life and his miracles and his care for the poor and his death and resurrection, and the fact that God did raise him from the dead sort of makes a claim upon an endorsement upon his whole ministry, which was about the poor and the dispossessed and those who couldn't defend themselves. And so Larry had a famous song called "The Outlaw," where he said Jesus was a bandit in his own time. That's the way the Roman government saw him. That's the way the religious leaders saw him, and that's the way we ought to be. The religious leaders and the extant church, the Jewish authorities at that time, did not like what Jesus was saying. He was outside the system, critiquing the system. That's how we ought to be. So in terms of his own personal beliefs, you probably couldn't have found a whole lot of difference between someone like him and Billy Graham. But on the other hand, he was very radical in the sense that he felt like the church was too bourgeois. There's a poem that he recited in concert a lot that was written by a poet and psychologist in the UK named Gordon Bailey, and it was called "First Time in Church," and it describes the experience of like a street kid, and his like gang of buddies that wander into church for the first time, and how bizarre a conventional sort of Anglican worship service would have been to that kind of person. And it concludes with this, Larry speaking in the voice of this character saying, there's this homeless man out on the street outside the church, and people came out of church and they'd smile and then they just pass right by. And, the last line of the poem is, "I get the message loud and clear. Church is middle class." So the institution of the church is for the elites, it's for the bourgeois class, but Jesus and his followers were this radical ragtag, unconventional, out in the streets group of people that were actually meeting the needs of people as they were. They were feeding the poor, they were healing the sick, they were proclaiming good news, to the poor and dispossessed of this world. And that's what Larry Norman was about. That was his version of Christianity. And it was very different than the institutional church of the time, which we were spending and still are spending multi-millions of dollars on church facilities that after the charismatic preacher, falls or leaves, sits empty.
Yeah. And also his, I don't even really want to call them positions, but just, he regularly is calling out civilization, including the church, for neglecting the environment, for terrible race relations. I mean, in some ways, he really had some values, some political positions that we would think of as progressive, and yet there's this core where he's an Orthodox believer. He's a Billy Graham guy. He's not some it's all just a symbolic metaphor, let's be liberal kind of Christianity. And it's a very strange mix for us today, because we find it, at least in the media or in people's presentations, much, it's a very rare thing to do. And he really, and also what you have with him is this like incredible passion and earnestness, but it's delivered in this sort of prophetic character. I think about him in terms of Dylan a lot, because, you listen to some of his songs and, you can hear Dylan, the echo of Dylan's voice in some of his tunes, some of his great tunes. And you can do that with a lot of people from the 60s and 70s. You listen to him, you can hear Dylan's voice because Dylan was so powerful. But with Larry, I hear something that he picks up on something, or he's able to actually incarnate something of Dylan that very few other people can do. And I can't even think of a single one right at the moment, which is the prophetic quality, the way that there's a quality of judgment and prophecy in Dylan's lyrics all the way through, but particularly, the kind of great, whatever, Desolation Row time, whatever, all, that that Larry was able to inhabit and carry on that same element that we've always had with Dylan. We're like, it might be a really cool tune, but the next one he might be just totally on your ass. He's totally getting on us for falling short. And even if that isn't always a religious idea in Dylan, sometimes it is. It has that kind of prophetic stance that, to my mind, Larry was able to do like no other Christian rocker at that time, and like few other rockers.
Well, you know, it's interesting about the lifestyle of, or the life cycle of some of these things, because I think it was actually Larry's work on Only Visiting This Planet and others that Bob Dylan wound up listening to that fed back into his gospel period. You know, as I explained in the book, Bob Dylan wound up going to a Bible study that Larry and his wife Pam had originally started called The Vineyard, and then it grew and beyond Larry's living room and became sort of like its own thing. But in the epilogue of the book, I explain how Larry's brother Charles was at LAX airport and he saw Bob Dylan sitting on a bench, you know, the hoodie pulled up over him, and he walked up and introduced himself, and Charles had his cart with, you know, his guitars and his musical equipment and stuff on it, and Bob said, you know, are you coming back from, you know, touring? And he said, yeah. I said, well, who are you with? And he said, my brother is Larry Norman. And Bob Dylan said, tell your brother I'm a big fan. So, you know, it's interesting. Someone like, yeah, I think Larry would have been inspired by Dylan, but then I think someone like Bob Dylan was also inspired by Larry Norman. And that's the way art is. But the difference, I think, between someone like Larry is Larry's like a true believer. I mean, one of the things, as we know about Dylan's biography, is that he created this huge backlash because when he refused to keep singing folk music and protest music, and, you know, he said, really, I just wanted to be Elvis. You know, I just wanted to be a rock and roll guy. But I wrote some of these songs that, you know, just were so electrifying at the time, and they were very evocative of the time. But, you know, once you get past, you know, those early Dylan records and you get into Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61 Revisited, there really isn't a lot of prophetic messages on those. For Larry, it was all prophetic. Somehow it was supposed to turn your worldview up on its head and be really challenging, whether it was about, you know, challenging the church to talk about sexually transmitted diseases when they didn't want to talk about it, to talk about institutional racism in the white church when nobody wanted to talk about it. He was willing to address those no-go areas, but do it in a way that the music was so good that you kept coming back and listening to it because it was great rock and roll.
Yeah, I think maybe now's a good time to play the other excerpt that we had selected before. This is from the record that Larry made after Only Visiting This Planet a year later with some of the similar crew from the UK, So Long Ago the Garden. And I want to talk more about the weirdness of that record in a minute. But first, I just want to play a selection from the song Nightmare Number 71, which has some of this Dylan-esque lyricism in it, but also, more importantly, expresses this intense kind of prophetic language and, you know, really brilliant, wacky, visionary lyricism that Larry could get going at some point. So let's hear a clip from Nightmare Number 71.
And soon I saw Atlantis rumble and rise high, and the great egg of Euphrates came down out of the sky. Out stepped Shirley Temple with Guy Kibbe, who was dead, and that communist Bill Robinson, whom Shirley called Black Red. They had a marionette, a Harpo Marx. They said it was an inside joke, but when I honked his horn, he came alive, and these were the words he spoke. With the continents adrift and the sun about to shift, will the ice caps drown us all, or will we burn? We polluted what we own. Will we reap what we have sown? Are we headed for the end, or can we turn? We paved the forests, kill the streams, burn the bridges to our dreams. The earth is bursting at the seams, and in pain a childbirth screams as it gives shines light to what seems to either be an age that gleams or simply lays there dying. If this goes on, will life survive? How can it? Out of the grave, oh, who will save our planet?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Nightmare 71 is it's like it's such an apocalyptic track. And maybe I think maybe this is a time to mention the role of apocalyptic expectation in that period of time, not just among Christians in some ways, because, of course, the counterculture itself was infused with a certain kind of nebulous millennialism. It looked forward to some transformation. Maybe it was consciousness, maybe it was a political revolution. And of course, many of the Jesus people in the late 60s and early 70s were themselves very apocalyptic. They felt that stuff was just around the corner. And indeed, one of Larry's most popular songs among Christians, I Wish We'd All Been Ready, is this amazing, strange, haunting, disturbing, beautiful song about the rapture. So how intense was that? How much was it like just almost given that things were about to shift radically? And how much was it just kind of a familiar stance to take, a certain kind of apocalyptic framework that's always sort of there in the prophetic side of Christianity?
Well, we know by reading church history that every generation has its sort of apocalyptic fervor. But when Larry wrote that song, I Wish We'd All Been Ready, it was the first thing of its kind to say, what if the world is coming to an end and there really is this moment in which Jesus comes back and evil is allowed to just sort of have its sway? Well, everybody worries about the world going to hell in a handbasket. And that's why a song like I Wish We'd All Been Ready was fodder for HBO's current TV series, their rapture series called The Leftovers. They've taken that apocalyptic theme of rapture but put it in a secular context, and they opened up season 3 with I Wish We'd All Been Ready. So I think that, whenever you look at great philosophers, there is this edge between millennialism, as you said, this sort of, hope for peace, love, and joy breaking out. This was Timothy Leary's, approach. LSD was going to usher in this kind of new enlightenment that would, sweep the world. But the other side of that is the worry that the dark forces of unfettered desire will finally take us over. And you remember, like 1968 is a big and violent year for the country. And it seemed plausible to people that everything might be coming to an end. And we are dealing with this right now. I mean, the President of the United States, public servant number 45, is listening to people who have these sorts of apocalyptic views of the end times. And so he thinks that somehow he's going to play into prophetic history by putting the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. I mean, this isn't esoteric stuff, Erik. This is stuff that's like in the news right now. So
no, it's remarkable.
Going back in the 60s with Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth, he preached on some of the same platforms that Larry was playing on. So this was all a hot mess back then, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely was. And it's also like listening to a track like Nightmare 71, and partly because I don't think I included that clip, but there's a whole thing about California, the earthquake, California like floating away and sinking. So I live in California, so it always has an extra little resonance.
It's the opposite, actually. California floats away and the rest of the country sinks.
Oh, I thought it was that parts of California float and parts of it sink. Oh, okay, there we go. Thanks for the exegesis.
So the message for Larry seems to be Hollywood's wins. It's the entertainment culture that actually gets away with it all, and the rest of the country pays for it.
That's hilarious. but more just the bigger picture, that sense of earnest apocalypticism that's going on in his voice. Yeah. It's like when you hear it now, you're like, it's just so in your face. It's like it's such a return in some ways, particularly to that time, because it's environment, it's terrorism, it's economic woes, it's fears of Middle East wars. There's a sense of a kind of almost a weird apocalyptic theater happening in Israel. Like there's this sense of something shifting, large forces that are both very political and military, but also they have this imaginal or scriptural kind of dimension to it. Like you say, the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem is remarkably significant on that level of religious allegory. So it all feels a little too close in a way. And I guess how does that affect Larry as he goes forward? That song itself is on So Long Ago the Garden, which got him in trouble with a lot of his Christian listeners. So did he almost like kind of go his own way because of his concerns with how things needed to change, is how the church needed to change? Did he end up like alienating himself more and more from a lot of his Christian listeners because of his radical stance?
Well, he's at the zenith of the Jesus movement, Larry becomes concerned that it has sort of become commercialized and has become sort of branded. And he sits on stage at the Royal Albert Hall in London and announces to the audience that he doesn't want to do, quote unquote, Christian concerts anymore, because he says, and I quote, "I don't want it to be said that he made money off of Jesus." So he didn't want this to be his career. He was trying to wake people up to certain things. And as soon as it became popular, because he was like kind of like a true artist, he wanted to go to that next place. And so his next album after that is utterly devoid of any explicit Jesus references. And it's a very dark, surreal, twisty, metaphorical and allegorical record. And people didn't like it because it wasn't straight up the middle. He wasn't preaching with it. So you say, well, in some ways, Larry's sort of hardcore and he's sort of straight up the middle preaching. But then as soon as you say that, you look at an album like So Long Ago the Garden, he's naked on the cover. All of his Christian fans are like, oh gosh, he's fallen away from the Lord. So this is a guy who sat on his own fence post and whistled his own tune. And he wasn't the definition of an artist. He almost felt like if it was commercial, there had to be something wrong with it.
Yeah, and that really, it comes through in the music, and it also comes through in the performances. I mean, one of the things that I was also able to gain from your book is a better sense of his power as a performer, and also how successful he was, particularly outside the United States later in his career, big world tours, huge fandoms in Australia and Scandinavia, all over the world. But he also had a very particular character as a performer. I mean, he was charismatic, but in a unique way. So could you give us a little flavor of what a Larry Norman concert was like, or what the vibe was that made it different than just an entertainer?
Well, the interesting thing about it, which I think really does set Larry Norman apart, is that he had this way of getting your attention and making it seem both extremely serious and also very entertaining and funny at the same time. So I describe at the beginning of the book the typical Larry Norman concert. He played with bands, and he had great bands over the years, but he always had a solo part of the concert where it was just him with a spotlight on stage, 2 mics, one for his cheap flamenco style nylon string guitar, and one for the vocals, both wet with reverb. And he would always, in his contract, stipulate that the guitar mic was to be set at the same level as the vocal mic. And inevitably, when he would get up and strum the guitar, they would have, in between the sound check and the actual show, turned down the guitar volume, because Christian music is about the message. It's not about the music. Well, he would hassle the sound guy. He would embarrass the sound guy and say, yeah, could you turn this mic up past where it says folk music? he would really give whoever the sound guy was, often at some ministry, a really hard time. Now, Larry did that for legitimate reasons, but he also kept doing it because he saw that it put people on edge. And instead of people happy clappy, this is an uplifting praise concert for Jesus, he would make people sit up on edge, and they're like there's a fight about ready to break out. All of a sudden, there you could hear a pin drop. And Larry had this mesmerizing effect on crowds. This isn't in the book, didn't make the final cut of the book, but he called it the green hand. He said there was like this thing that would come out of his head when he was performing that would create a silence over a crowd. But then he would crack a joke. So, like he would say things like, I grew up in a really conservative fundamentalist church, and they said that dancing was wrong because it's a horizontal expression of a vertical thought. He would crack these jokes, or actually a horizontal expression of a vertical desire, or whatever it was. He was references, and people would be roaring laughing. But then he would get really intimate. And I think this is what part of his staying power over the long term was, that people actually were coming for these intimate, captivating performances. So it was way more than just the records. It was his whole environment that he created in concert. And like you said, at the zenith of his career, he was selling out major auditoriums all around the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting to track him forward too. I mean, my own interest in Christian music is sort of in inverse proportion to the growth of the industry of contemporary Christian music, and so I never even frankly listened to some of the later records because I'm like, it'll be kind of terribly produced and whatever, and it was unfair of me because some of his late records were really as powerful as anything that he did. So. Yeah. Talk a little bit about, I'm kind of interested in two things. One is just how he continued to be an independent artist through the 80s into the 90s, as the Christian music industry consolidated and became quite lame in a lot of ways, in most ways, in my opinion. And also the way in which some of the energy and fervency of the Jesus movement of the 70s, of the early 70s, kind of became incorporated and, transformed and reinfused more mainline church experiences and currents in the States. It kind of got absorbed, if you will, in some ways that were interesting. You mentioned the Vineyard earlier, that small Bible study started, eventually became one of the more powerful revival movements of the late 70s and early 80s, churches all over the world, people bringing in very intense experiential relationship, et cetera, et cetera. So as some of the energies and relationships and dreams of the Jesus people were incorporated into the mainstream, into more mainstream situations. At the same time, Jesus music itself is becoming this immense commercial behemoth. How does Larry navigate through all that that changing landscape in his later career?
Well, he was a victim of his own success because he was trying to use an art form of rhythm and blues and straight up rock and roll to talk about something that nobody wanted to talk about. But what happened is that the church created a subculture out of it. There's the old cliche that Christians should be in the world but not of the world. But the problem really is that Christians are of the world, but they're not in it. So they would just take this form of Christian rock and they created their own record labels. They created their own ministries surrounding this. So nowadays, we don't remember a time at which there weren't drums and guitars in church. I mean, that was verboten back during when Larry started. So in that environment, I think Larry saw himself as being somebody who was very critical of the Christian music industry. There was a magazine that was supposedly going to be like the Rolling Stone of Christian music. It was called CCM Magazine, Contemporary Christian Music Magazine. And when the founder of it and editor of it, John Still, ran the idea by Larry just kind of mocked it. He said, what is now Jesus, different songs about Jesus subject to some sort of popularity contest? You're going to rank a top 10 for Jesus? Like, that's not what this was about originally. And so he created a lot of enemies. And his efforts to keep the artistic element in Christian music and not allow it to drift into just pure propaganda really was a failure. So he became, as the 80s wore on and into the 90s, he became more and more of an outsider as this billion-dollar industry, grew up. And at one point, Christian rock was making more money than jazz, rhythm and blues, and classical music combined.
Yeah, it was big business for sure. I mean, it continues to be in different ways. Well, here I feel like I should mention, as a kind of fan, I of course watched David DiSapatino's Fallen Angel documentary. When it came out, a number of years ago, and I knew David from other contexts and from his Frisbee documentary, which I like a lot more. And basically at the end, he's kind of saying that not only was Larry, essentially a kind of sociopath and liar, but that he was a BS Christian. He wasn't even really faithful. And it seemed very puzzling to me because it doesn't jibe with the music, because I don't know the story, until I read your book. I didn't know that much about the story, but it just didn't jibe with the music. I was like, nah, this doesn't seem right. So, now reading your book, I go, okay, that actually was not that accurate a portrayal, and it was a lot more complicated than that, and some of it involves finances and personal relations, and you go into great detail on some of these controversies in your book. We don't need to go into the details here, but the part that really kind of puzzled me was the sense that he wasn't even really a Christian. And is that like a move that happens inside the Christian world? Like, you really want to screw somebody, you go, oh, you're not even really a Christian, when it's so obvious that even if you don't agree with the guy, that like he's earnest. I mean, what was the kind of was there an element of the Christian community that's so angry at Larry Norman? I mean, he's pilloried in this. People want to get him in some way. What I don't get that.
Well, the Christians don't like. They don't want anybody to be elevated over anybody else. So actually, Friedrich Nietzsche talks about this as his big critique of Christianity is that everyone has to be a sheep. No one can be a shepherd. You've got to be the same as everybody else. And the fact that sort of Larry thought of himself as being, an artist and sort of, a prophetic voice, and he mythologized himself in that way, it made people really angry, because they were like, well, you're not better than the rest of us. And so he made a lot of people upset because he sort of acted like, well, listen, I'm the paterfamilias of this whole situation. I'm the father of Christian rock. And, it's a Freudian thing. The Freudian move, the Oedipus complex, is the father has to die. You got to kill the father in order for you to be something. And I do think that I saw that happen quite a lot. There were people that Larry took under his wing. And then, one of the things I say in the book is like, Larry inspired a lot of people, and they developed their own dreams. But what happens when, somebody's dream doesn't work out? They look at, well, who gave me this? You gave me this dream. And then you become the living embodiment of the fact that dreams don't come true. So there's a lot of anger that comes with that. Now, I don't know what the motivations were, psychologically behind all these people. I can't judge that. But he was a polarizing figure because he didn't play nice with anybody. And everybody knew that. It was a feature of his personality. He was a contrarian. Larry was itchy. And what I found to be sort of the standard format was he was really hard on Christians, but if you were a sinner, you got all of the grace and forgiveness and love in the world. That's the way Larry operated. You know, he held Christians to a high standard, and then they imitated him. They held him to that high standard, and it became a fight. You know, it's this mimetic desire of you know, everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants what Larry was. You know, they wanted to be this elevated art or whatever. And so, you know, that becomes a family fight at that point. But, you know, there's so many chapter and verse about, you know, how Larry would treat, you know, people in concerts. I saw this myself personally. He would stand for hours after concerts praying with people if they were, you know, a kid that, you know, was thinking about committing suicide, or, you know, was on drugs, or was completely alienated from their parents. I mean, I've read his diaries. He corresponded with these people. He reached out to those. So there was a lot of love for people that didn't know Jesus. But, you know, if somebody claimed to know Jesus and they, you know, they didn't act like it, he was hard on them and they were hard on him right back.
Yeah. Well, we only have a few minutes left in this. I know this is a big question, but I feel like throwing one that way. I know you another book you wrote is about what you call recovering classic evangelicalism, and you kind of look partly to this period in the 70s and figures like Larry as representing a kind of possibility for evangelicals that to some extent is not panning out now. And obviously there's so many things to talk about, relationship to Trump. I mean, there's, you know, that's a whole other story. We don't have time for it. But what would you say, what you can learn from Larry Norman, or the kind of Christianity that he was doing, the kinds of questions he brought, that you would like to see more of today, that you think has something to say, at the very least to Christians, if not to everybody?
Well, you know, I think that the answer to that question is, where's the skin in the game for Christians? I think that Christian culture has gotten very sedate. It's very comfortable. There's a lot of money involved with it. There's a lot of self-perpetuating institutions and ministries and organizations that are built around professional God talk. And Larry didn't want a safe place for that. He thought that if you really believed in who Jesus said he was, you wouldn't create these little hermetically sealed off stained glass silos. You would actually be out in the art world. You'd be in the film world. You would be in the business world. You would be mixing up amongst these people so that they might actually get to see somebody who was a Christ follower. And I think today, especially, Larry was always concerned about, you know, Christianity getting too cozy with, you know, power and the zeitgeist. You know, even though he was friends with Jimmy Carter, when Larry went and played at the White House, you know, he criticized Henry Kissinger's foreign policy in his musical number. So, you know, he was always going to have that prophetic edge. And I think that, you know, as Chuck Colson once said, the lions of the waiting room become the lambs of the Oval Office. Like, as soon as you get close to power, you just kind of wilt and you do whatever they want you to do. And so now I think what's happened is people just identify evangelicalism with this particular weird right-wing religious expression. And I think Larry is an example of somebody who said, you know, I am not going to be beholden to any body, any institution, any church, any organization. I'm going to read my Bible and follow Jesus and let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, that's very well said, and I think maybe we'll wrap that up here. Except I just wanted to say one note, which I appreciate just the gesture you made there in terms of seeing a world where Christians and non-Christians are getting together over art, over ideas, over where this sort of separation and this tribalism that is now going on in our society are so intense. And I just want to say I appreciate talking to you and wherever you're coming from, and you're talking to me, and we're having this conversation, and we're united over our love of this figure. But we're also making a gesture towards a world where there's more communication across these lines.
Well, it's a privilege to be on your program, and I love the title of the program, Expanding Minds. We should be open. Because as Augustine said, all truth is God's truth. So, let the truth run wild wherever it may be found. And it usually is going to critique us and surprise us.
Excellent. All right, Gregory Alan Thornbury, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank all you out there. Keep your minds open.